Close your eyes for a moment and imagine that you are walking along an old narrow road made of dirt or perhaps paved with weathered stones. All around you, houses with wooden frames and uneven stone walls appear as if they had sprouted from the ground itself, and the smell of burning wood, mixed with the aroma of baking bread and dried herbs, fills your nostrils. The wind carries sounds of distant laughter, horseshoes hitting the ground, and muffled music that seems to be coming from somewhere nearby. Now your eyes come across a curious building with a wooden sign hanging from rusty iron chains, swinging gently. The sign has the design of a foaming mug, a smiling boar, or even a symbol of some forgotten story. You are standing in front of the entrance to a medieval tavern. A heavy oak door with twisted iron squeaks as you push it open. Inside, the light is yellowish and flickering, produced by candles and torches attached to the walls. The sound of excited voices, loud laughter, the clinking of mugs and the strumming of a lute create a unique soundtrack. A whole world pulsates inside between sips of beer, pieces of rustic bread and stories told around the fire. This is exactly the universe you will travel to in this video, a complete, detailed, immersive journey. Let's explore together, step by step, what it was like to visit a tavern in the Middle Ages. From the moment you approach the entrance to the sounds and flavors you would encounter when you cross the threshold. What were these buildings like inside? Who frequented them? What did they eat and drink there? Were there rules or was everything allowed? What were the people's behavior, customs and interactions between nobles, peasants, artists, travelers, and even strangers like? More than just places to eat or have a drink, medieval taverns were the social heart of towns, cities, and even the roads that crisscrossed the European continent. They were meeting places, places of conversation, plots, and even conspiracies. Yes, in many cases, decisions that changed the fate of entire regions began at a tavern table, between sips of mead and bites of roast meat. In this first section, we'll open that initial door, set our feet on the cold, dusty ground of medieval reality, and understand the general context of these taverns. This isn't a fantasy from movies with knights shining in the sunlight. We're talking about real life, with all its strong smells, loud sounds, and unexpected moments. If you're over 30, you probably grew up watching period films, perhaps playing some tabletop RPG or video games set in castles and forests. But what we're going to bring you here goes beyond fiction. It's a living reconstruction of the medieval experience. And yes, you'll discover that visiting a tavern was a true adventure, with everything you'd expect. Excitement, danger, pleasure, music, fights, folk wisdom, and lots of history. Over the next few blocks, every detail will be carefully explored. We will talk about the architecture of these taverns, how they were built, what materials they were made of, and how they were organized inside. We will also delve into the menu of the time, what was eaten, how it was prepared, what type of drink was served, and how it was stored. You will understand that many things that we consider refined or exotic today were common in taverns in the Middle Ages, and others that we consider simple, like a cold beer, did not even exist in the form we know today. Let's step into the shoes of the regulars, sweaty peasants after a day's work, wandering knights in search of shelter, merchants from distant lands, nomadic musicians who exchanged stories for coins, strong women who not only served, but also ran their establishments with a firm hand. And we'll see that, despite the time that separates us, much about human behavior, socialization, and coexistence is still surprisingly familiar. The idea is to create a living, breathing timeline. This won't be a dry history lesson. Here you'll feel the wood beneath your hands as you sit on a bench, hear the sound of liquid being poured into a ceramic mug, feel the warmth of the central fireplace, and maybe even laugh when a troubadour sings off-key about dragons and maidens. We'll recreate the setting with visual, sensorial, and cultural details so that you feel like you're actually in a medieval tavern. And before we go any further, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment on the time and country from which you are watching this boring story now. And have you ever imagined what the lighting in a place like this was like at night without electricity? Have you ever thought about what it was like to share the same space with unknown travelers, with their own smells and accents. Have you ever thought about how food was served without cutlery for everyone, without refrigeration, often cooked in large cauldrons suspended over the fire? So get ready. Grab your imaginary mug, put on your cape, pull up the stool closest to the fire and come with me. The first round is on us. Welcome to the tavern. May the night be long, full of stories, and may you survive until dawn. Imagine that you have now walked through the heavy oak door of the tavern. It takes a moment for your eyes to adjust to the flickering light of the room, lit only by torches attached to the walls, candles in candlesticks, and perhaps a rustic fireplace burning in the background. Graname. Smell of the place is intense. Smoke, sweat, wet leather, cooked onions, and old beer form a combination that may seem strange at first, but that, curiously, becomes familiar over time. The noise is constant, like a river of mixed voices, laughter, shouts, singing, and the occasional dry sound of a chair being dragged or a fist hitting the table. And it is in this setting that the real stars of the place emerge, the tavern's regulars. We are not talking about extras or medieval stereotypes from a storybook. Each person there has their own story, their own reason for sitting on that hard wooden bench, their suspicious look or their easy smile. Let's get to know better who these people were and why these taverns were so important in their lives. Just inside the door, perhaps leaning against the wall, stands a street vendor, exhausted from a day of wandering the village streets or the fields. He carries a cloth bag strapped to his body, filled with trinkets, needles, dried herbs, small, glass vials of mysterious liquids, and perhaps even a sharp knife that he swears is real steel. He drinks slowly, watching everything, attentive, ready to barter if the opportunity arises. Further along, a sunburned peasant enjoys a bowl of stew and a mug of dark beer, while complaining to a friend about the feudal lord who raised taxes, or about the poor harvest that year. These are conversations that seem simple, but they carry the weight of real life for those who depend on the land and struggle to survive. In the darkest corner of the room, a group of hooded travelers murmur among themselves. No one knows exactly where they came from, and few dare ask. They observe everything without saying much, and their presence commands respect. One of them perhaps bears a scar that runs from his eye to his chin. Another carefully cleans a dagger. They are there for a short time, a meal, a drink, and then they are back on the road. Not far away, laughing loudly and already staggering, a troubadour in colourful clothes strums an out-of-tune lute and sings a song about a cursed castle, a lazy dragon and a maiden who would rather stay single. The people around laugh. Some sing along, others throw coins on the table to encourage the improvised spectacle. And next to the counter, watching over everything with watchful eyes and firm steps, is the owner of the tavern. Yes, it was not uncommon for women to be the owners or managers of these establishments, and they often commanded respect like no one else. With a cloth tied around her waist and a direct way of speaking, she knows everything that goes on inside. Who came in looking like a troublemaker, who owes money last time, who drank too much and needs to be escorted out. Her gaze is sharper than any knife in the kitchen. This mix of people created a vibrant ecosystem. Nobles in more modest attire might sit next to a beggar, not because they wanted to, but because the tavern was one of the few spaces where these social boundaries could cross, albeit awkwardly. Fights might break out over a misinterpreted look, a sly comment, or someone taking the wrong seat. But alliances were also formed there. Business deals were struck. Marriages were arranged. Unwritten contracts were sealed with a handshake and a drink together. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever imagined yourself sitting at one of these tables? Which character would you be? The silent merchant, the mysterious warrior, the clumsy bard, or the curious one who just observes everything, like someone watching a live theater? Write in the comments below. Seriously, I'm curious. Each one of you would have an incredible role in this story, and take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, because look, there's still a lot to happen on this visit to the tavern. In the next sections, we'll explore the drinks served, the curious customs at the table, and even the unspoken rules that everyone there quickly learned, or got caught trying. Here the content is always built with attention to detail, and your participation makes everything more fun. So leave a like, activate the bell, and get ready, because the bard is already tuning the instrument for the next story. Returning to the tavern hall, what draws the most attention is not the drink, although there was plenty of it, nor the food, which was often just enough to fill the stomach. What really made the tavern a special place was the conviviality. At a time when most of life took place between the countryside, the castle, and the church, the tavern was an outlier, a place where people could laugh out loud, tell lies without guilt, exaggerate their achievements, lament their losses, plan for the future, and forget, even if only for a few hours, the harshness of the present. The tavern was both stage and audience. It was bar, restaurant, theatre, confessional, and living room. Every corner of it had a story waiting to be told, or reinvented. And what we are going to do now is exactly that. Continue delving into these stories. Let's sit at the table, grab a mug, and discover what people ate and drank in these taverns. Prepare your stomach. Medieval cuisine is more surprising than you can imagine. Now that we know the atmosphere of the tavern and who used to frequent it, it's time to sit down, literally, at the table. And the question that immediately arises is, what was there to eat and drink there? Prepare your stomach, because the medieval menu was very different from what we are used to today. No juicy burgers, pizza with stuffed crust, or soda with ice. Here the menu was simple, rustic, and, in many cases, a veritable roulette of flavors and risks. As soon as someone sat down at the table and ordered something, if they had the money, of course, the first thing that usually arrived was beer. But don't get excited just yet. We're talking about a beer that's very different from the one you find chilled in the supermarket. Medieval beer was often tepid, almost lukewarm and cloudy, since the filtration process was rudimentary or non-existent. It could be weak, with a low alcohol content, consumed even by children, or stronger, used to warm the body on cold nights. There were no hops as we know them today. The flavor came from local herbs, and the result could range from surprising to undrinkable. But why was beer so prevalent? Simple. Drinking water was a serious problem in the Middle Ages. In many places, water was contaminated, especially in cities. Boiling the liquid to make beer helped eliminate some of the risks, so drinking beer was, in a way, a public health measure, or at least the least dangerous alternative. And what was on the plate? The most common food was bread, of course. But forget about the fluffy French roll. Medieval bread was dense, dark, made with rustic grains and, depending on the region, even mixed with ground tree bark or sawdust. Yes, you read that right. When flour was in short supply. It was often already hard, so people would use hot broth to soften it before eating. With the bread came the stew or casserole. This was the dish of the day, and indeed the dish of every day. A thick soup made with whatever ingredients were available, seasonal vegetables, a little salted meat when available, beans or lentils, and a few herbs for flavor. Some well-stocked taverns might offer game meat, such as wild boar or venison. Others, especially in coastal villages, served dried or smoked fish. Have you ever heard of stone broth? Well, a similar recipe was not uncommon. A large cauldron where each person added whatever they had, and the mixture gained flavor over time. In fact, it is said that in some taverns the same stew would boil for days on end, literally. People would eat, replenish with water, vegetables, bones, and so on. The same dish could last an entire week. A true eternal gastronomic cycle. To accompany the meal, in addition to beer, there was also mead, an alcoholic drink made from the fermentation of honey with water, sweeter, stronger, and much appreciated at parties. And for the nobles or wealthier clients, there was wine, although it was less common in northern regions of Europe and much more present in the south, where vineyards thrived. Dessert, almost never. The concept of dessert as we know it is modern, but sometimes, on special occasions, dried fruit, a rustic apple pie or figs dipped in honey might appear. And of course we can't forget the spices. Medieval nobility was obsessed with exotic seasonings, such as black pepper, nutmeg, and cinnamon. In the tavern, the seasoning was more restrained: garlic, onion, parsley, perhaps mustard. But if a merchant from the east showed up with something different, such as saffron or cloves, It became a luxury that could even justify an increase in the price of the meal. Now think about it. Would you try one of these dishes? Or would you just drink beer and pretend you've already had dinner? Tell us in the comments, which of these medieval dishes would you be willing to try? And take advantage of the fact that the imaginary waiter hasn't arrived yet, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Here we serve curiosity in generous portions, with a historical seasoning and that taste of discovery. Leave a like, share with those who love to delve into ancient history, and comment on what else you want to see here. Who knows, maybe in the next video we'll visit a medieval fair or a knight's training camp. Returning to the tavern, the most curious thing about food is that despite its simplicity, it had a function beyond nutrition. It created community. Sitting at the table was a social act. Sharing bread signified trust. Toasting with a mug was a sign of peace. Offering a piece of meat could signify respect or an attempt to create alliance. And refusing a dish, depending on the occasion, could be an insult. The tavern table was, therefore, a space of unspoken codes, of subtleties, of reading intentions. Eating there was also a political, effective, symbolic gesture, and each bite, or spoonful, carried the flavor of something greater than just food. After exploring the tavern's main hall, with its din, clinking mugs and the smell of stew in the air, it's time to look beyond the obvious, because not everything in a medieval tavern was limited to funny stories, drunken fights, and lively songs. Quite the opposite. There, hidden among barrels, heavy curtains, or half-open doors, there was a parallel, almost secret universe that few first-time visitors would even imagine. Yes, we are talking about the dark side of taverns. Imagine you're there, enjoying a simple meal, when a grumpy-looking guy approaches and whispers something to the innkeeper. Suddenly, the owner of the place disappears through the back, carrying a bag or a hidden piece of parchment. You might ignore it, but for those who lived in that era, it's easy to understand. Business is being done there, and not all of it is exactly legal. Taverns were meeting places, and not just for tired peasants and passing soldiers. They also served as meeting points for spies, illegal traders, smugglers, and even members of clandestine sects. After all, where else would it be possible to gather people of different origins without attracting attention? In a castle? No. In a temple? Impossible. The tavern was the ideal place for those who needed to speak without being heard, act without being seen. And the back of the tavern had multiple uses. Some establishments had small, discreet rooms where card games, clandestine gambling, and even silent duels took place. In busier places, these spaces were separated by heavy curtains or thin wooden walls. Sometimes you had to give the innkeeper a password to gain access, a sort of medieval password. Here, amid the smoke from oil lamps and the strong smell of fermented alcohol, anything could happen. A merchant might strike an illicit deal with a local bandit. A royal servant might trade information with a foreign spy, or perhaps a wanted thief might try to sell stolen jewels to someone willing to ask no questions. It is no wonder that many kingdoms tried, unsuccessfully, to regulate or monitor taverns. But it was a virtually impossible task. The owners of these establishments knew the codes of silence well, knew when to ignore and when to intervene, and, when necessary, they had henchmen, usually thugs, who also served drinks, ready, to solve problems with their fists, out of sight of the common customers. And if you think things couldn't get any worse, just wait until you find out that some taverns were used as fronts for even more dangerous activities. During times of religious persecution, for example, certain groups used these spaces as shelter. There, in a secret room or hidden basement, meetings, clandestine masses, or even political meetings were held. Secret codes were exchanged on beer mugs and symbols scratched. Into the wood indicated who was trustworthy and who was not. Another dark side of the taverns was prostitution, a practice present in many of these places. Not always explicit, but often tolerated. The women who worked there often came from difficult backgrounds: orphans, refugees, landless peasants. Some found protection within the walls of the tavern, others were cruelly exploited. And in this complex environment, danger was always lurking, for everyone involved. Even games of chance, which might seem like harmless fun, had hidden pitfalls. Betting was easy, but getting out of a game in one piece was another story. Cheating, threats, revenge, and disputes were common. A dirty look was enough to light a fuse that ended in all-out brawls, sometimes with blood on the floor and tables overturned. But not everything was doom and gloom. There are records of taverns that used these dangerous funds intelligently. Some organized tournaments with rules and prizes. Others created spaces for political debate disguised as poetry meetings. It was the medieval way of resisting, of informing oneself, of keeping the flame of freedom alive in dark times. So the next time you imagine a medieval tavern as just another old-fashioned pub, think again. That barrel leaning against the wall could be hiding a secret passage. That laughter in the background could be the cover of a dangerous negotiation. And that friendly barkeep with the dirty apron and the watchful eye may know a lot more than he lets on. In the next section, we'll take a break from this dense atmosphere and delve into something lighter, but no less fascinating. The music and dances that livened up the nights in the taverns. What instruments were used? What types of songs were sung? Who were the artists of the time? Stay close because the party is about to begin, and you're more than invited. If you closed your eyes upon entering a medieval tavern, it wouldn't take long for you to be enveloped by a veritable festival of sounds. It wasn't just the voices of lively conversation or the clinking of mugs as they toasted. What really gave the place its soul was the music, lively, rhythmic, and infectious, and often accompanied by dancing. Music was one of the greatest joys of the common people in the Middle Ages. In a time when work was hard, hygiene was questionable, and wars were constant, moments of celebration became almost sacred, and the tavern was the perfect stage for this. But what kind of music was heard? There? No modern bands or playlists on your phone, of course. What dominated the atmosphere were live melodies played by wandering artists, troubadours, minstrels, and local musicians. They carried their instruments from village to village, often in exchange for coins, food, or lodging. And when one of these musicians showed up at a tavern, you could be sure that the night would gain a new energy. The most common instruments were rustic but efficient. The fiddle, an ancestor of the violin. The lute, wooden flutes, drums made of stretched leather, and even small bells. There were also more exotic instruments, such as the viola da roda, which produced a continuous sound with a crank turning strings, and of course the bagpipes, popular in regions such as Scotland and Ireland, which gave a unique and powerful sound to parties. The music was often improvised, with lyrics that spoke of battles, lost loves, harvests, ancient gods, political satire, or simply the joy of being alive. Some songs were known by everyone, as if they were the hits of the time, and all it took was for someone to start singing for the whole tavern to join in by clapping their hands or stamping their feet. And then came the dance. Dancing in the tavern was different from any formal ball for the nobility. Here the atmosphere was free, spontaneous, and unceremonious. There were group dances with everyone holding hands and twirling around the tables. Others were more lively, with steps marked on the wooden floor which made everything vibrate. Literally. Small children, tired old men, women in aprons, and soldiers in light armor, everyone participated. And of course there was no shortage of drunks who tried to dance and ended up falling on the benches or tripping over their own feet, causing everyone to laugh. There were also professional dancers, known as acrobatics, who delighted the audience with acrobatics, juggling, and rehearsed choreography. Many of these artists traveled in groups, performing in taverns, fairs, and even castles when they were lucky. Their performances mixed music, dance, and even a touch of theatre. Sometimes they wore masks, acted out short stories, or did funny mimes for the audience. Music's role went beyond entertainment. It was also used to convey messages, tell stories, and even warn of danger. A troubadour might sing about a recent battle, an approaching plague, or a new tax imposed by the feudal lord. In a time without newspapers or radio, song was a powerful form of information. In fact, in some regions, tavern musicians were always in conflict with local authorities. After all, not every song pleased the nobles or the church. There were critical, daring, even indecent lyrics. But for the people, these songs were like small acts of rebellion, of freedom in the midst of a controlled life. Another interesting detail is that some taverns had themed weeks, so to speak. One night was dedicated to Celtic music, another night only love songs or satires about the clergy. All of this encouraged customers to return and gave the tavern an almost theatrical atmosphere. And don't think that everything was laughter and joy. Music also accompanied sad moments. When someone from the village died, sometimes it was in the tavern that friends would gather to sing in their honor, in a kind of informal wake. Melancholic songs filled the atmosphere, creating a deep emotional connection between those present. In some cultures, it was believed that singing helped the soul of the deceased find the path to peace. Many musicians we now consider legendary began their lives playing in taverns, not for fame, but out of necessity. Some left their names immortalized in manuscripts or popular ballads, passed down orally for generations. Others were lost to time, but their legacy lives on in the idea that the tavern was not just a place to eat and drink. It was a space where popular culture flourished. And when the last chord was played, when the tavern keeper blew out the lamps and the musicians bowed goodbye, everyone left with a lighter heart. Even if it was cold outside, even if life was hard, for a few hours, everything made sense. Imagine yourself entering a medieval tavern after a long day of traveling on dirt roads, braving the biting cold and accumulated fatigue. You push open the solid wooden door, feel the warmth of the fire in the fireplace, and are immediately invaded by an unmistakable smell. Roasting meat, freshly baked. Bread, spices in the air, but what exactly was eaten and drunk inside? Unlike what we see in movies, where everyone seems to eat pork and drink mead in abundance, the reality was much more varied, and, at times, surprisingly creative. Medieval taverns were not only places to get drunk, but also true gastronomic refugees of the time. All, of course, within the possibilities and the season of the year. The food in taverns varied greatly depending on the region, the season, and the social class of the patrons. In general, the menu was made up of simple and easily available ingredients. A common dish was a vegetable stew with meat, something between a thick soup and a stew, cooked in a large cauldron over the fire. It could include pieces of pork, rabbit or chicken, carrots, turnips, onions, and even grains such as lentils. It was a hot, cheap meal that could be served in large quantities. The seasoning? Well, that was limited. Salt was precious and expensive, and herbs such as rosemary, sage, or thyme helped to give it a special flavor. And bread, of course, was indispensable. Rustic, dark, sometimes made with barley or rye, it served both as a side dish and as a cutlery. It was common to see people using pieces of bread to scoop up food on the plate, or even as an edible base for stew. An interesting fact, some breads were so hard that they turned into bowls. After the meal, you would eat the entire container. No waste. But if you wanted something more special, like a roast leg of pork, you would have to pay more. Prime cuts of meat, such as beef or game, deer, wild boar, were usually only available to wealthier customers, nobles, knights, or successful merchants. The common clientele, on the other hand, could get by with more modest but no less tasty dishes. Now let's get to the most talked about and perhaps most lively part of the tavern, the drinks. The absolute star was the beer, but not the clear, cold one we know today. Medieval beer was cloudy, thicker and in some cases even a little sweet. It was made with barley malt, and sometimes had bitter herbs instead of hops, which only became popular later. It was common for the drink to be served at room temperature, in clay or wooden mugs. In addition to beer, another popular drink was mead, made by fermenting honey with water. It was more expensive, more refined, and often reserved for special occasions or for nobles. It had a sweet, strong flavor, and yes, it could make you dizzy if you drank too much. There was also wine, of course, especially in regions with a winemaking tradition, such as France or parts of the Iberian Peninsula. However, medieval wine was very different from today's, more acidic, less filtered, and often mixed with water or spices. Interestingly, plain water was avoided because in many places it was considered unhealthy and carried disease. Fermenting alcoholic beverages helped kill bacteria, making them safer to drink, which is why even children sometimes drank a very weak version of beer called small beer. And we can't forget the cheeses, which were also part of the menu. Since they were easy to store, had a long shelf life and could be made at home, cheeses appeared on boards, accompanied by dried fruits, nuts, or even sausages. Each region had its own types, from the hardest and most cured to the freshest, similar to a firmer cream cheese. At parties or on special days, people could eat pies filled with meat, fish, or vegetables. And, believe it or not, even desserts had their place. Apple pies with cinnamon, honey cakes and spice cookies, all made with simple but tasty ingredients. The smell of food mixed with the sound of laughter, the clinking of mugs, and the music in the background. Eating in a tavern wasn't just about eating, it was about participating in a collective ritual, a moment of pleasure, connection, and even negotiation. How many business deals were made between one bite and the next? How many stories began with a, "Sit down, friend, and try this stew"? The kitchen was usually located at the back or in a separate area of the tavern, with large pots and pans over open fires, bubbling pots and pans, and waiters rushing to fill orders. The sanitary conditions, of course, were far from what they are today, but by the standards of the time, this was where the best food was prepared for travelers and locals alike. In short, a visit to a medieval tavern was a true experience for the senses. You sat on a wooden bench, took a steaming bowl, dipped your bread in the thick broth and washed it all down with a generous swig of warm beer. And in the midst of all this, you shared the moment with people from all over, soldiers, peasants, merchants, artisans, even disguised clergymen. It was there, surrounded by food and drink, that medieval life gained flavor. Although many people think that a medieval tavern was a place of general chaos, where anything goes and no one respected anyone, the truth is that these places did have their rules, even if many were unspoken, followed more by custom than by written laws. We're not talking about a modern restaurant with napkins and polite waiters, of course, but it wasn't a circus of savagery every day either. As soon as a visitor entered a tavern, he immediately had to read the room. There were no signs indicating where to sit or how to behave, but there was a social etiquette that, if disregarded, could result in serious problems, from being thrown out to a good beating. It all started with choosing a seat. Unlike what we see in movies where everyone randomly mixes together, in medieval times there was a kind of invisible division between groups. Peasants sat on one side, soldiers on another, merchants at another table, and travelers usually sought out the farthest corners to observe before joining in. Sitting down without being invited could be seen as disrespectful and was a quick way to get into trouble. Another important point was how people spoke to the tavern keeper. This person was more than just someone who served food and drink. He was often also the owner of the establishment, the guardian of local order, and even, on occasion, an informant for the authorities. Therefore, treating him rudely or arrogantly was a serious mistake. In many taverns, a gesture or a look from the tavern keeper was enough for everyone to understand that someone was overstepping their bounds. The tone of voice also mattered a lot. In a crowded tavern, it was normal for the atmosphere to be noisy with laughter, exaggerated stories, and even music. But that didn't mean anyone could shout or swear openly. There was a clear difference between a cheerful customer and a troublemaker. Anyone who crossed that line could be quickly surrounded by the other patrons or even thrown out unceremoniously. And speaking of fights, they did happen. After all, with alcoholic beverages, inflated egos, and delicate matters on the table, such as debts, love, or politics, it was impossible to completely avoid them. But curiously, most taverns tried to control this type of trouble, not because they were peaceful places by nature, but because fights scared away customers, damaged furniture, and worse, attracted the attention of local guards or soldiers, which no one wanted. Therefore, settling disputes with sharp words was a highly valued art. Knowing how to provoke without offending too much, or responding sarcastically without starting a fight, was a skill almost as important as knowing how to use a sword. Many experienced partygoers knew exactly how to gauge the tension in the room and keep things from getting out of hand. Another essential part of etiquette was knowing when to listen and when to speak. In many cases, taverns served as meeting places for those with important news, interesting stories, or even confidential information. Some merchants used the tavern to price check, hear rumors about safe or dangerous roads, or even hire people for a job. Listening to other people's conversations was tempting, but showing that you were listening could be considered extremely disrespectful or dangerous, depending on what you heard. For this reason, a low gaze and a discreet posture were the allies of those who wanted to remain in peace. But there was also the opposite, people who used the tavern to show off. Storytellers, troubadours, musicians, and even amateur magicians appeared there frequently and artistic. Performances were welcome as long as they did not interfere with the harmony of the place. And yes, there were rules for women too, although many of these rules varied greatly from region to region. In some taverns, the presence of women was rare and even frowned upon, seen as misconduct. In others, especially in cities, it was common to see women working as waiters, cooks, or even owners. There were also those who circulated for more ambiguous purposes, but again, it all depended on local custom. The important thing to understand is that the tavern was a mirror of society. What was accepted outside was repeated inside. And the games. Oh, the games were a vibrant part of the atmosphere. Dice, rudimentary cards, simple boards, anything went to pass the time and try to earn a few bucks. But be warned, cheating was one of the cardinal sins of the tavern. Being caught cheating on a bet was a serious offense, and the punishment was often swift and brutal. Often the cheater would be dragged out, thrown in the mud, or forced to buy everyone around as compensation. One of the most respected attitudes was generosity. Someone who offered a drink to strangers or helped a weary traveler find a place to sit gained prestige. Simple gestures, such as sharing a piece of bread or paying for someone less fortunate's meal, were valued and remembered. Taverns were, after all, temporary communities formed by strangers who needed to live together, and in this context, kindness made a difference. In short, entering a medieval tavern was more than just looking for food or drink. It was entering a space of coexistence where everyone had to understand their role, respect others, and know when to keep quiet or tell a good story. It was a social microcosm with its own dynamics, where those who knew how to play the game of coexistence came out on top. When we think of a medieval tavern, it is almost impossible not to imagine the lively sound of music in the background, the laughter, of people carried away by songs and the incredible stories that someone tells to entertain the audience. These figures who brought joy and excitement to the atmosphere were the artists, troubadours, musicians, singers, and sometimes even acrobats or amateur magicians. They were the soul of the tavern, and without them the experience would have been much less vibrant. The troubadours, for example, were more than just musicians. They were traveling poets who created and performed songs that spoke of love, bravery, tragedies, and even recent events in the region. Many of them were skilled with simple instruments such as lutes, flutes, drums, and bagpipes. Their music not only entertained, but also served to spread news and preserve local history, since few people knew how to read or write at that time. The important thing to understand is that the work of these artists was not as economically valued as it is today. They had to perform in several taverns, traveling constantly to earn money and food. Therefore, in addition to talent, it was essential to know how to captivate the audience, adapt the repertoire to the public, and have a stage presence that would attract attention, without exaggerating and irritating the owners of the place or the regulars. The diversity of artists was enormous. Some were dedicated professionals, others were amateurs who had a natural gift for music or telling funny stories. There were also the court jesters or buffoons who used humor and clowning to liven up the atmosphere, even if their jokes were sometimes quite harsh or contained veiled social criticism. This mix made the taverns places of joy, but also of reflection. In addition to their songs and stories, the artists had an important social function. At a time when official information was often slow to arrive and access to knowledge was restricted, the songs and tales transmitted by the troubadours circulated quickly and helped to shape popular opinion. They might, for example, sing about a new king or a battle that had taken place, influencing the way people viewed these events. And interaction with the audience was a fundamental part of the show. Unlike modern shows, where the artist is on stage and the audience remains passive, in medieval taverns, the performances were much closer and more intimate. The musicians could exchange glances, take requests, challenge someone to sing or play along, and even improvise according to the mood of the audience. This closeness created a special atmosphere of complicity and fun. Another interesting aspect is that, despite their popular fame, these artists were not always well regarded by the authorities. Some were considered suspicious, as their freedom of expression could upset nobles or local leaders. In certain regions, troubadours and musicians had to be careful about what they said, as they could be censored or even arrested for political or social criticism disguised in their songs. In taverns, musical instruments also played a symbolic role. The lute, for example, was one of the most common and considered elegant instruments, associated with stories of chivalry and romance. Bagpipes and drums were more popular among peasants, with livelier rhythms for dancing and parties. These varied sounds created an atmosphere that enchanted everyone from the humblest to the richest merchants. And how did these artists get paid? Money was often scarce, so they would take whatever clients could offer. Coins, food, drink, or even shelter for a few nights. On special occasions, a more generous client might commission an exclusive song or pay for a private performance, which helped the artist survive for a little longer. It is worth remembering that, in many taverns, the patrons themselves also participated in the performances. It was common to see someone with a beautiful voice join the troubadour to sing a song, or a visitor with musical skills improvise a performance. This created a very lively and democratic atmosphere where everyone was part of the party. Despite all this joyful activity, it wasn't all party time. Artists had a hard life, full of uncertainty, dangerous journeys, and sleepless nights. They had to deal with cold, hunger, and loneliness, as well as the constant risk of disagreements with clients or authorities. Even so, it was a lifestyle that many chose, driven by their passion for art and the desire to bring joy wherever they went. In short, tavern artists were responsible for transforming a simple resting place into a space of culture, entertainment, and social exchange. They made the longest nights seem short and filled people's hearts with hope, humor, and excitement. And speaking of which, if you're enjoying this journey through the history of medieval taverns, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your comment. We want to know, what song or story would you like to hear in a medieval tavern? Tell us and join us on this adventure. Entering a medieval tavern also whetted one's appetite for a variety of flavors, aromas, and culinary experiences that may seem exotic today, but were part of everyday life for people of that time. The food served there reflected local conditions, the seasons, access to ingredients, and of course the social status of the patrons. There was not always plenty to eat, but the taverns knew how to prepare dishes that would please and sustain those seeking rest and reconnection. Before talking about the menu, it is worth remembering that hygiene and food preservation methods were very different from what we know today. Refrigeration did not exist, so meat and fish were salted, smoked, or preserved in lard to make them last longer. Fruits and vegetables were consumed fresh in season or dried for later use. These factors directly influenced what was offered. Among the most common foods was bread, which could vary greatly in type and quality. Rustic bread made with wholemeal flour was the most common and cheapest, consumed by most people. The wealthier could afford white, lighter breads. Bread was often used to accompany soups and stews, which were practical and nutritious dishes made with vegetables, meat, and cereals. Speaking of soups, they were practically the official dish of taverns, since they were easy to prepare in large pots and could feed several people at once. Medieval soups were usually thick, with plenty of seasonal vegetables, onions, garlic, and herbs. For those who had access to them, pork, beef, chicken, or fish were added, making the dish more tasty and energetic. Meat, when available, was a precious commodity. In villages, daily consumption was limited for most of the population, who depended more on grains and vegetables. But in taverns, especially in cities or commercial areas, It was possible to find pieces of roast meat, stews, or sausages, such as homemade sausages. Pork was one of the most common meats, as it was easier to raise and almost all parts of the animal could be used. Fish was also widely consumed, especially in regions near rivers, lakes, or on the coast. In times of religious restrictions, such as on Fridays and periods of fasting, fish was the main source of protein. Many taverns had simple and tasty recipes for baked, boiled, or pickled fish. Among the side dishes, grains and cereals such as barley, oats, and wheat were widely used to prepare porridges and breads. They were staple foods that provided energy and sustenance. Fresh and dried herbs such as thyme, parsley, and cumin were used to season and add flavor, compensating for the lack of salt on many occasions. Now, when we talk about drinks, taverns played an essential role in social life. Water was not always safe for consumption, especially in cities due to contamination. Therefore, people mainly consumed beer, mead, and wine, which were fermented and safer. Medieval beer was very different from the beer we know today. It was made with malted barley and local herbs without the use of hops as a preservative. Its flavor was sweeter and less bitter, and its alcohol content varied greatly, but it was usually lighter than modern beers. For the common population, beer was almost an everyday drink, even consumed by children, because it was less risky than water. Mead, a drink made by fermenting honey with water, was popular in some regions, especially in Northern Europe. It had a sweet taste and was valued both as a social drink and as a remedy for certain ailments. Wine was more common in wine-producing regions such as France, Italy, and Spain. In taverns, wine could be served pure or mixed with spices and herbs, creating a kind of mulled wine or flavored wine that helped warm the body on cold days. An interesting fact is that in medieval taverns, drinks were often served in shared cups. It was customary to share the same container among friends, a gesture that showed trust and friendship. Today, this may seem strange, but at the time, it was an important symbol of social relations. In addition to alcoholic beverages, taverns also offered some simple options, such as water flavored with herbs, juices made from seasonal fruits, or infusions of medicinal plants. All of this helped to diversify the menu and cater to those who preferred to avoid alcohol. As for desserts, they barely existed as we know them today. Sweets were rare and expensive, made mainly from honey or dried fruits such as dates and figs. Sweet dishes were often eaten on special occasions, religious festivals, or banquets. And finally, an important point, food and drink in taverns were not only used to satisfy hunger and thirst, but also to strengthen social bonds. Sharing a table, breaking bread, or toasting with a mug of beer created connections that went far beyond the simple act of eating. It was a time for exchange, conversation, alliances, and often important decisions were made at these tables. If you're enjoying this trip to the past, be sure to leave a like and share this video with your friends who also enjoy history. We want to know what dish or drink you'd like to try in a medieval tavern. Let us know in the comments. In the next section, we'll delve even deeper into the customs and lives of the taverns, revealing who these people were, their roles in society, and the curiosities surrounding their visits to the taverns. Get ready to meet some incredible characters. Entering a medieval tavern was almost like visiting a small microcosm of society at that time. Contrary to what many people imagine, taverns were not places exclusive to a single social class. They attracted a huge diversity of people, each with their own goals, stories, and reasons for being there. Understanding who these people were is essential to understanding the true importance of taverns in the Middle Ages. Initially, taverns were places where travelers rested, merchants traded, and locals gathered. There was a constant flow of people arriving from near and far, bringing news, products, and novelties. For a traveler, the tavern was a kind of safe haven, a place to rest, eat, and prepare for the next stage of the journey. Among travelers, it was common to find artisans who came to collect raw materials or sell their creations, messengers who brought letters and important news, as well as itinerant traders who traded in everything from fabrics to spices. These people used the tavern to do business, find partners, or simply exchange information. For many, the tavern was the center of the local commercial network. Another important group were local workers, such as farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters and stonemasons, who would frequent the tavern after a hard day's work. For them, the place was a place to relax and socialize, where they could relax, listen to music, tell stories and, of course, have a drink to ease their fatigue. These people represented the basis of the medieval economy and needed places where they could feel part of a community. In addition, taverns were frequented by soldiers and mercenaries, especially in cities or regions close to conflicts. For these men, taverns served as a meeting point to organize groups, receive orders, or simply relax between battles. These warriors often brought fascinating stories, which enlivened the conversations and aroused the curiosity of the other visitors. An interesting aspect is the presence of artists and musicians. Many troubadours, bards, and minstrels used the taverns as a stage to present their songs and stories. They not only entertained customers, but also helped spread news, legends, and even social criticism. Music in the taverns created a lively and welcoming atmosphere, making the space even more attractive. However, not all of the regulars had such a respectable reputation. Taverns also attracted people of dubious reputation, such as thieves, scoundrels, and other figures from the medieval underworld. These individuals often mixed with the general public, taking advantage of the crowds to plan scams or simply hide from justice. This meant that taverns were places of great movement, but also of constant surveillance. Women, although present, generally had a more restricted role in taverns. They were often owners or worked in the establishments as waiters or cooks. Others, especially those who worked as courtesans or escorts, frequented these establishments to find clients. It is important to remember that women's social role was quite limited at the time, and their presence in taverns reflected this. In terms of social hierarchy, taverns could bring together everyone from humble peasants to nobles, seeking a little more contact with the people. Nobles, especially in larger cities, might visit taverns to mingle discreetly or to negotiate with merchants and artisans. However, in general, they preferred more exclusive and refined environments, leaving the taverns to the lower classes. This mix of people made taverns places of coexistence, where different worlds intersected. It was a dynamic environment where information was exchanged, alliances were made, and even conflicts were resolved. The medieval tavern was, therefore, much more than a simple bar. It was a vital space for the social and economic functioning of the community. It is worth noting that, depending on the location and type of tavern, the profile of its patrons could vary greatly. In small villages, the tavern was almost always the meeting point for the entire community, with less distinction between classes. In larger cities, taverns could specialize, catering to specific audiences, such as merchants, sailors, or soldiers. Finally, a point that deserves to be highlighted. Taverns were places for conversation and the exchange of information. In times without newspapers or radio, it was there that people found out about local news, decisions made by authorities, and even distant events. Conversations at the table, over sips of beer and snacks, shaped our opinions and influenced the social and political life of the time. If you're enjoying this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next blocks. And tell us, which medieval tavern character would you like to be? The adventurous traveler, the lively musician, or the clever merchant? Leave your comment. Entering a medieval tavern was like entering a world where the daily grind gave way to celebration, entertainment, and socializing. After a tiring day of work or travel, people sought refuge there to relax, have fun, and exchange stories. And it was in this environment that various traditions and customs were consolidated, forming a true culture of taverns. In this section, we will explore these aspects and understand how taverns functioned as cultural and leisure centers. One of the main forms of entertainment in taverns was music. Musicians, bards, minstrels, and troubadours performed regularly, singing songs about love, battles, adventures, and even recent events. These performers carried the news wherever they went, transmitting information orally to those who could not read or write. The musical environment created a lively atmosphere that encouraged those present to sing, dance, and interact. Medieval music had a wealth of rhythms and instruments that may seem exotic today, but were essential to creating the atmosphere of the taverns. Instruments such as lutes, flutes, tambourines, bagpipes and lyres filled the air with melodies that echoed off the stone walls. These performances could be improvised or organized, depending on the occasion, and the musicians were often tipped in coins or even in food and drink. Along with music, taverns offered a variety of games that helped pass the time and foster friendly rivalries among patrons. Dice games were very popular, especially among travelers and soldiers who enjoyed testing their luck and betting small amounts. In addition to dice, other games of manual skill, such as throwing rings or spears at improvised targets, entertained the customers. Games, however, were not just entertainment. They had an important social role. They fostered camaraderie and healthy competition, as well as functioning as a way to resolve disputes or challenge strangers. It was common for provocations and bets to arise in the heat of the game, which increased the adrenaline and the involvement of everyone. Another common custom in taverns was telling stories at the table. Storytellers, whether professional or amateur, delighted their audience with tales of fantasy, heroic adventures, and funny stories. These narratives had the power to unite the group, creating a sense of community and identity. Many stories were passed down orally from generation to generation, enriching the local cultural tradition. In addition, it was common for seasonal festivals and celebrations, such as religious festivals or harvest-related events, to be held in taverns. On these occasions, the atmosphere became even more festive, with more music, dancing, food and drink available. These celebrations helped to strengthen ties between residents, giving them moments of joy and rest amidst the hardships of medieval life. Interestingly, taverns were also places where some strange customs or superstitions could be observed. Many people believed in omens, luck and curses, and certain rituals were practiced to attract good fortune or avoid bad luck. For example, some customers would knock on the wood of the table before starting a game or avoid sitting in certain places considered unlucky. These beliefs were part of everyday life and influenced people's behavior. Another typical habit was the use of toasts during drinks. Toasts to important events, such as the birth of a child, a good harvest, or victory in battle, were very common. The act of raising a glass, looking into the eyes of one's companion, and wishing health and luck was a ritual that strengthened the bonds between those present. The tavern atmosphere was also marked by a comfortable informality. There were no rigid protocols, and people sat at the table as if they were at home, sharing what they had, be it stories, food, or drink. This sense of belonging and welcome made the tavern a very special place in medieval social life. And of course, even with all this fun, there was always a need to avoid excesses and confusion. Although alcohol was an important part of the social life, it was necessary to maintain order so that the taverns did not become places of uncontrolled fights and violence. For this reason, many establishments had figures responsible for security, such as the tavern keeper or an assistant, who made sure that things did not get out of hand. If you're enjoying this trip back in time, take the opportunity to like and share it with your friends who also love medieval stories. And take the opportunity to comment below. What game or tradition would you like to try in a medieval tavern? Bet on dice, listen to a bard, or dance to the sounds of the alleys. When you think of a medieval tavern, one of the first things that comes to mind is the food and drink that was served. After all, the smell of food being prepared and the sound of glasses clinking are essential elements in creating the atmosphere of this special place. But what exactly did people eat and drink back then? What were the ingredients, dishes, and drinks like? Let's discover together the flavors that marked medieval taverns. First of all, it is important to remember that food in the Middle Ages was very different from what we know today. Agriculture was still developing, and ingredients varied greatly depending on the region, the season, and the social status of the people. In taverns, food had to be simple, tasty, and affordable for most customers, who were workers, travelers, merchants, and even soldiers. One of the most common foods in taverns was bread, especially dark, dense bread made from whole wheat or rye flour. This bread was the staple of the diet and was often served as a side dish for other dishes, or even as a plate to hold the food. In addition to bread, soups and broths made with vegetables, herbs and sometimes pieces of meat were often consumed. These preparations were nutritious, easy to make in large quantities, and helped to warm the body on cold days. Meat was also present in taverns, although its consumption was more frequent in regions where animal husbandry was common. Pork, beef, poultry, and in some areas, even game such as rabbit and deer were used. Generally, the meat was boiled, roasted, or transformed into sausages and smoked to ensure better preservation. It was rare to find very elaborate dishes, but the rustic flavor and natural seasonings, such as aromatic herbs, made all the difference. To accompany meals, taverns offered vegetables and greens, many of which were grown in local gardens or collected in the wild. Peas, beans, onions, garlic, cabbage, and turnips were common, often cooked in broth or served as a garnish. Fresh herbs such as thyme, sage, and rosemary were used to add aroma and flavor to dishes. As for drinks, medieval taverns were famous for their variety, which went beyond the wine and beer we know today. Beer, in particular, was one of the most popular drinks, made from barley, wheat, or rye, and consumed daily by most people. It was safer to drink than water, which was often contaminated. Tavern beer had a strong, often bitter, flavor, and was generally cloudier and less carbonated than modern beers. Wine was also highly prized, especially in wine-growing regions such as southern Europe. Medieval wine could range from very sweet to dry, and was consumed by all social classes, although the wealthiest had access to the best quality and aged wines. In some taverns, it was common to find wine mixed with spices and honey, creating aromatic and sweeter drinks. Another typical tavern drink was mead, made by fermenting honey with water and sometimes with herbs or fruits. Mead was a sweet alcoholic drink, valued for its unique flavor and for being considered a noble drink in some cultures. Despite this, it was also found in taverns, especially in regions where beekeeping was common. In addition to these alcoholic beverages, taverns also served non-alcoholic beverages for those who preferred or could not consume alcohol. Herbal infusions, teas prepared from local plants, and even fresh filtered water were common, although the latter was rare and not always reliable. The food and drink served in medieval taverns also reflected seasonality and agricultural cycles. In the fall, for example, it was more common to find dishes made with harvested foods, such as pumpkins, apples, and roots. In the winter, broths and stews were more common, as they helped to maintain body heat. This connection with nature and the cycle of the seasons gave tavern cuisine a strong identity. An interesting fact is that, despite their apparent simplicity, medieval taverns were places where culinary experimentation took place. Tavern keepers and cooks used available spices such as pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and nutmeg to create more elaborate and pleasant flavors. These spices came from trade routes that crossed continents, bringing exotic aromas and flavors to the tables. It is also worth noting that, due to the hygiene conditions of the time, taverns had to take special care to preserve food. Salt was one of the main preservatives used to preserve meat and fish, while smoking was another widely used technique. Food was stored in ceramic pots or wooden boxes, often covered to keep out insects and dirt. Now, imagine the scene. A rustic wooden table lit by candles and torches, full of simple but tasty dishes, with the scent of herbs, fresh bread, roast meat, and the strong aroma of freshly poured beer. The sound of lively conversation, laughter, and the clinking of glasses complete this scene that transports us straight to the heart of a medieval tavern. If you're enjoying this immersion into medieval taverns, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single detail of this incredible series. And tell me, what dish or drink would you like to try? Have you ever imagined trying a mug of mead or a warm winter stew? When thinking about medieval taverns, it is impossible not to imagine a place full of life, where different types of people met to talk, rest, eat, drink, and sometimes resolve conflicts. Taverns were true social centers, meeting points that brought together everyone from the humblest to people of certain prestige, creating a unique and intense mix of stories and personalities. Let's learn more about who these people were, how they lived, and what they sought in these special environments. First, we must understand that the tavern was not only a place to satisfy hunger and thirst, but also a space for exchanging information, business, and entertainment. Manual workers, artisans, merchants, soldiers, and even minor nobles who did not have a fixed residence were frequent visitors. Each one brought with them their own story, their problems, and their expectations. Peasants, for example, were a group that used to frequent taverns, especially after long days of working on the land. For them, the tavern represented a moment of relief and relaxation. It was there that they could meet with friends, listen to stories, and sing popular songs, often accompanied by simple instruments such as flutes, drums, and guitars. These gatherings helped to create a sense of community and belonging that was very important for those who lived a hard and difficult life. Craftsmen and merchants, in turn, used the tavern not only for leisure but also for business. It was common to close deals, discuss prices, and plan deliveries over a drink. For these groups, the tavern functioned as a kind of networking center, where contacts were made and opportunities arose. The informality of the environment made negotiations faster and often more reliable, since participants could directly observe each other's reactions. In addition to these groups, soldiers and mercenaries also had a strong presence in taverns. After long campaigns or journeys, they sought rest, food, and company. Taverns, often located near fortresses, castles, or military routes, were strategic points for these men. There, in addition to relaxing, they could exchange information about battles, hear rumors about wars, and even recruit companions for their adventures. The atmosphere there could be quite lively, with singing, fights, and stories of courage and bravery. It is important to note that although taverns were public places, entry was not always free to all. There were implicit and explicit rules that regulated the behavior and, in some cases, the frequency of visitors. People of ill repute, criminals, or individuals with disorderly conduct could be expelled. However, the environment was not entirely safe. Disputes and brawls occurred quite frequently, and the tavern keeper needed to maintain order to ensure that his business continued to function. Another group that we can highlight are the itinerant artists, such as musicians, storytellers, jugglers, and actors. These artists traveled from village to village, performing their shows in taverns and other public squares. They were essential for the entertainment of the population, bringing joy, news, and often disguised social criticism in their shows. The performances could last for hours, and the interaction with the audience was intense, making the tavern a dynamic place full of surprises. In medieval taverns, it was also common to find women, although in smaller numbers than men. Many were tavern owners, tavern keepers, or assistants responsible for preparing food, serving drinks, and taking care of the place. Other women frequented the taverns to socialize, especially those linked to merchants or artisans. Unfortunately, some women also worked as courtesans or prostitutes, a fact that was part of the complex social dynamics of these environments. To better illustrate this diversity, imagine the scene. A robust and smiling tavern keeper welcomes a group of tired peasants, while at the same table a merchant negotiates with a local artisan. In the corner, a bard tunes his lute to sing a new song, while some soldiers discuss strategies for a recent battle. Voices mingle in a constant hubbub, filled with laughter. Occasional fights and agreements made. This mix of characters and situations made the tavern a microcosm of medieval life, where anything could happen. In addition to social interactions, taverns played an important role in the transmission of information. Since there were no newspapers or radio, news traveled through direct conversation. News about wars, political changes, local events, and even gossip circulated quickly in these environments, making taverns essential for the flow of information at that time. And if you find this journey through the medieval tavern fascinating, don't forget to leave a comment, share your impressions, and of course, subscribe to the channel to follow all the details of this incredible journey through time. Your participation helps a lot in the creation of more content like this. In the next section, we will explore entertainment in medieval taverns, the music, dances, games and parties that enlivened these special gatherings. Stay tuned to find out how leisure was expressed in those times, which were so different from ours. Having understood who frequented medieval taverns, let's now delve into one of the most vibrant and essential aspects of these spaces: entertainment. Taverns were not just places to drink and eat. They were true cultural and social centers where fun, music and dance played a fundamental role in daily life. Imagine the energetic atmosphere, with sounds of laughter, instruments playing dance steps and voices singing. This environment helped to alleviate the burden of the hard routine that most people faced at that time. Music was undoubtedly the heart of tavern entertainment. Unlike today's elaborate shows, medieval tavern music was simple, straightforward and highly participatory. Common instruments included lutes, flutes, fiddles, drums, fifes and recorders. Often, traveling musicians or local bards were hired or invited patrons to listen to songs that spoke of everyday life, heroes, love, battles, and even humorous stories. These songs had easy-to-remember lyrics, which allowed almost everyone in the tavern to sing along, strengthening the sense of community. In addition to professional musicians, it was common for patrons to actively participate in the show. Collective singing, improvisations, and musical challenges livened up the atmosphere, and many knew at least one popular song. The songs could range from cheerful and festive to melancholic, depending on the moment and the mood of the group present. Participation was essential, as it helped to transform the tavern into a welcoming and lively place. Dancing was another important form of entertainment. Medieval dances were not choreographed like those we know today, but rather simple collective movements in which participants would gather in circles, lines, or pairs to spin and move to the rhythm of the music. These dances could be rhythmic and energetic, or soft and rhythmic, and were often used to celebrate festivities, harvests, or simply socializing. Dancing in taverns helped to strengthen social bonds, relieve tension, and create lasting memories. Another common form of entertainment was games and challenges. Some games were simple, such as dice, primitive board games, and contests of strength or skill, such as tug-of-war or sprints. These moments of competition, in addition to being entertaining, also allowed people to test their physical and mental capabilities. In some taverns, gamblers would place small bets, which added excitement and risk to the game. However, as might be expected, these games sometimes led to fights, especially when alcohol was already present in large quantities. Taverns were also the setting for special parties and celebrations. Important dates such as religious festivals, local holidays, harvests, or military victories were celebrated with large gatherings where food and drink were plentiful. On these occasions, the atmosphere was even more lively, with lots of music, dancing, laughter, and sharing stories. These events helped to reinforce the identity and unity of the community, as well as providing moments of escape from the difficult routine of everyday life. An interesting fact about parties in medieval taverns is that they were often accompanied by typical foods of the time, prepared with local ingredients and often simple. Dishes such as stews, rustic breads, cheeses, smoked meats, and dried fruits were common. The predominant drink was beer, quite different from the one we know today, darker and with a stronger flavor. But there was also wine, especially in regions where production was stronger. Alcohol helped to create a relaxed atmosphere, but it could also be a source of confusion when excessive. In addition, tavern keepers, the owners or managers of taverns, often organized special events to attract customers. They might host themed nights, challenges between patrons, or even performances by traveling artists, increasing the diversity and richness of the entertainment. This creativity was essential to ensuring the survival of the establishment amid the competition and economic difficulties of the time. If you are enjoying this journey through time and want to know more about the curiosities and incredible details of medieval taverns, don't forget to leave a like, comment on what surprised you the most so far, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any chapter of this historical adventure. Your participation is essential so that we can continue bringing you rich and interesting content. Now, let's get to what many people love, the food and drink served in medieval taverns. Today, when you visit a themed tavern or even a museum, you might imagine refined dishes and elaborate flavors, but the medieval reality was very different. The food in taverns was mostly simple, rustic, and focused on what was available locally. The food was influenced by the time of year, the region, and the social status of the patrons. Taverns served mainly dishes that could be prepared easily and in large quantities, since many customers arrived hungry after long journeys or hard work. Among the most common dishes were stews, thick broths made with meat, vegetables, herbs, and spices that were available. These stews were very nutritious, and because they were cooked slowly, helped to make use of less valuable parts of the meat, such as bones, tendons, and tougher cuts, which would become tender during cooking. It was a dish that was filling, warming, and relatively inexpensive for tavern owners. In addition to stews, bread was a constant presence on the table. Bread was often dense, made from coarse, unrefined flour. It was used both to accompany food and as a base for pâté, cheeses, or even to clean the plate and collect the remains of sauce. Bread could also be eaten plain, especially by those who didn't have much money to spend. Meat was consumed, but not always in large quantities or of good quality. Pigs, chickens, and cattle were the most common animals, and depending on the region, wild birds and fish from rivers and lakes also appeared on the menu. Since refrigeration did not exist, fresh meat was a luxury for many, and cuts were often salted or smoked to make it last longer. During periods of fasting or in poorer regions, the diet could be almost entirely vegetarian, based on cereals, vegetables, and greens. Speaking of vegetables, these were very important in the diet of the lower classes. Onions, garlic, turnips, carrots, cabbage, and peas were the most common and were present in broths and side dishes. Aromatic herbs, such as thyme, parsley, and rosemary, helped to add flavor to dishes, since expensive seasonings such as pepper were rare and expensive. As for drinks, beer was the star of the taverns. At that time, beer was different from what we know today. It was usually darker, cloudy, and had a variable alcohol content, often lower than that of modern beers. It was drunk daily by many people, even children, as drinking water was not always safe for consumption, and beer offered a more reliable alternative. In addition, medieval beer was made with simple ingredients: barley, water, and yeast, with some regional variations. Wine was also present, especially in wine-producing regions such as parts of France, Italy, Spain, and some regions of the Iberian Peninsula. However, wine was generally more expensive and consumed by people of higher classes or on special occasions. In simpler taverns, wine could be diluted with water or mixed with spices to extend its consumption. Another lesser-known drink was mead, a type of wine made from fermented honey, which had a sweet taste and was quite popular in certain regions of Northern Europe. Although it was not as common as beer or wine, it did appear at parties and celebrations. To sweeten, medieval people used honey, dried fruits such as dates and raisins, and, to a lesser extent, sugar, which was expensive and imported from distant regions. This influenced desserts and drinks, which had more natural flavors and less sugar than what we are used to today. An interesting detail is that many of the dishes and drinks were consumed at different temperatures. Hot drinks, such as herbal teas or broths, were common, especially in winter. The dishes, which were usually served hot, helped to replenish energy and combat the cold on difficult days. In taverns, care was also taken with the quantity served. Portions were controlled to avoid waste and ensure that everyone could be served, especially during peak times. Some customers preferred stronger drinks to accompany their meals, while others opted for something lighter, depending on the occasion. When visiting a medieval tavern, the experience of tasting these rustic flavors is essential to understanding what daily life was like at the time. Food and drink were more than just necessities. They were elements that brought people together, created bonds, and provided comfort in difficult times. Before we move on to the next section, it's worth remembering that the channel wants to hear from you. Which of these foods or drinks are you most curious to try? Leave a comment below and share your impressions. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to continue following this incredible journey through the history of medieval taverns. We have now come to a fundamental aspect of understanding what life was like inside medieval taverns, the rules, customs, and behaviors that govern this environment. Although today we might imagine taverns as chaotic places full of fights and confusion, the reality was a little more complex. Taverns were important public spaces for social interaction, and so there were a series of rules, often unwritten, that everyone had to follow to maintain order and ensure that the experience was pleasant for the majority. First of all, it is important to understand that taverns welcomed a wide variety of people: merchants, artisans, peasants, travelers, soldiers, nobles in disguise, and even local authorities. This diversity required a certain balance to avoid serious conflicts. Therefore, the rules of behavior were usually based on mutual respect and discretion, especially in larger and more organized places. A very common custom was respect for the table where one was sitting. Unlike modern bars where people move around freely, in the medieval tavern, each group or customer had their own reserved space, and it was considered rude to invade the space of others without permission. If a customer wanted to sit at an occupied table, it was customary to ask permission and wait for an invitation to join the group. This practice helped to avoid unnecessary arguments. In addition, taverns had rules about consumption and payment. Generally, it was not allowed to leave without paying or consume more than the permitted amount before paying the bill. In some taverns, customers paid upon arrival. In others, the bill was settled at the end of the visit. But the idea that one could drink or eat for free did not exist. The tavern owner needed to ensure a profit to keep the business going. Excessive drinking was discouraged, although it was quite common. Intoxicated patrons could be ejected or, in more serious cases, handed over to the local authorities. Many tavern owners preferred to maintain a safe environment and avoid problems that could damage the reputation of the establishment. For this reason, some taverns had staff members responsible for monitoring patrons' behavior and ensuring that everything remained under control. An interesting point about the customs in medieval taverns is that some of them prohibited the entry of women, especially those considered indecent or prostitutes. However, in other regions or in larger taverns, women were allowed to frequent and even work as owners, cooks, or singers. The presence of women directly influenced the atmosphere and the types of activities that took place inside the taverns. Music and entertainment also had their place in tavern life, but they were kept under control so as not to disturb conversation or business. Musicians and bards were often invited or hired to play at specific times, such as feasts, celebrations, or important events. The sound of music, instruments, and voices helped to create a welcoming and lively atmosphere, but excessive noise could be frowned upon. As for conflict, taverns were not completely free of fighting, but they were not as frequent as one might imagine. Often fights arose due to personal disputes, local rivalries, or excessive drinking, but tavern owners and patrons generally tried to resolve issues quickly to prevent them from escalating. In more serious cases, local authorities could be called in to intervene. In addition to the basic rules of coexistence, taverns were also places where alliances and friendships were cultivated. It was common for groups of frequent merchants or workers to create lasting bonds, making taverns regular meeting points to discuss business, exchange information, and even plan joint actions. Another important custom was the practice of hospitality. Welcoming a traveler or a stranger with an invitation to share a meal and a drink was a sign of respect and generosity. This practice often helped to strengthen social and commercial networks, especially in towns or villages where people depended on mutual cooperation to survive. It is also worth noting that, despite the strict social rules, taverns were places of great relative freedom. There, people from different social classes could mingle more than on the streets or in noble houses, allowing for a cultural and social exchange that did not occur in other environments at the time. This freedom, however, came with the need to maintain a balance to avoid disorder. Finally, it is essential to remember that rules and customs varied greatly depending on the region, the size of the tavern, and the profile of its patrons. Taverns in large commercial cities had different rules than small rural taverns, and those frequented by nobles had their own etiquette that was much more formal. If you're enjoying this journey through the world of medieval taverns, don't forget to leave a comment about which rule or custom has caught your attention so far. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next episodes of this series full of history and curiosities. After understanding the rules and customs that maintained order within medieval taverns, it's time to get to know the people who made these places run on a daily basis. Without them, there would be no food, drink, or even the service that made a visit enjoyable, or at least bearable. We'll talk about the owners, cooks, waiters, and other workers who made up the team behind the bar, revealing their roles, challenges, and even interesting stories. Starting with the tavern owner, he was usually a central and highly respected figure. In small towns, the owner might be someone who also lived on the premises, practically living inside the tavern. In larger cities, the owner might be a merchant who managed several taverns, hiring employees to take care of the day-to-day running of the tavern, keeping the tavern open, ensuring the quality of the drinks and food, and dealing with problematic customers were his direct responsibilities. In addition, the owner had to negotiate with suppliers, pay taxes, and sometimes deal with local authorities to keep everything in order. The cook, or cook in some cases, was another essential character. Cooking in those days was no easy task. Medieval kitchens had few modern utensils, and hygiene conditions were very different from what we know today. The cook had to prepare tasty dishes using local, often limited seasonal ingredients, and ensure that the food was ready for customers on time. In some taverns, the food was simple: soups, stews, breads, and roast meats, but it still required skill and attention. The fire was kept alive in large hearths, and cooking involved a lot of physical effort and care to avoid accidents. Waiters or servers played an essential role in the customer experience. They were responsible for taking orders, serving drinks and food, clearing tables, and generally making sure customers felt welcome. These workers were often young apprentices who started out helping with simple tasks and, over time, learned the trade and perhaps took on greater responsibilities. Speed and friendliness when serving customers made a difference in keeping them coming back, which is why good waiters were valued. In addition to these main roles, there were other important workers. For example, the porter or assistant who brought the barrels of beer or wine to the bar, sometimes a heavy job requiring physical strength and endurance. There were also musicians and bards, who were not always permanent employees of the tavern, but were invited to liven up the atmosphere on special days, such as feasts or celebrations. In some places, women worked as housewives, tavern keepers, or kitchen assistants, despite the social restrictions of the time. A constant challenge for all these workers was dealing with customers of varying temperaments. Dealing with drunks, fights, and complaints was part of everyday life, and patience was a necessary virtue. Often the owner or waiter had to act as a mediator to prevent small disagreements from turning into bigger problems. Another important point is that work in taverns could be exhausting and socially undervalued. Workers worked long hours, starting early to prepare the environment and finishing late at night when the last customer left. In addition, hygiene conditions were poor, and exposure to smoke, dirt, and sometimes abuse from customers posed constant risks. However, working in a tavern also offered opportunities. For young apprentices, it was a chance to learn a trade and gain a better social position in the future. For musicians, it was a way to gain recognition and a loyal following. And for owners, the tavern could be a lucrative business and a source of prestige in the community. It is worth noting that the relationship between workers and customers could be quite close. In many taverns, regulars created bonds with the waiters and cooks, which helped to make the environment more welcoming and familiar. This interaction was essential to the success of the establishment, as people liked to return to places where they felt recognized and well treated. If you find it interesting to learn about the behind-the-scenes of medieval taverns, why not share in the comments which of these workers you would like to be? Or if you have visited a similar historical site today, tell us about your experience. And of course, be sure to subscribe to the channel to follow this series that reveals all the details of medieval taverns. When visiting a medieval tavern, One of the most striking aspects is the drinks served. Much more than simple refreshments, they were a fundamental part of the local culture, economy, and even traditions. Understanding what the typical drinks were, how they were produced and consumed, helps to get a better understanding of what the real experience was like for those who frequented these taverns centuries ago. Let's start with the most famous and popular of all, beer. Medieval beer was very different from modern industrial versions. Often produced locally, beer had a stronger, darker flavor and a denser texture. This was because the manufacturing processes were artisanal, without modern equipment that allows for perfect filtration and strict control of fermentation. The basic beer recipe included malted barley, water, and wild yeast. Some regions added herbs or spices to give it a unique aroma and flavor, such as hops, which began to be used to preserve the drink. Another widely consumed drink was mead, made by fermenting honey with water. Mead has a sweet and fruity flavor and was especially popular in rural areas or among Nordic and Celtic peoples. Mead could be simple or more elaborate, with the addition of herbs and spices, and was served both for everyday use and for celebrations and religious rituals. Because of its sweetness, mead was a milder alternative for those who did not like the bitterness of beer. Wine was the preferred drink of the upper classes, especially in Mediterranean Europe. Regions such as France, Italy, and Spain were famous for their wine production, and the quality varied greatly depending on the climate, soil, and methods used. In medieval taverns, wine was served in simple jugs or glasses and could be consumed straight or mixed with spices and honey, forming the so-called hippocras, a hot and aromatic drink, especially popular in winter. In addition to these main beverages, there were other less common options such as fruit wine, made from fermented apples, cherries, or other fruits. Distilled beverages also existed, although distillation as we know it today only became popular after the Middle Ages, so these early versions were more rudimentary and used for medicinal or ritual purposes. The way these drinks were consumed was quite different from what we are used to today. For example, taverns did not have standardized glasses or cups. Often mugs made of wood, ceramic, or even animal horns were used, which gave the place a rustic charm, but also made hygiene difficult. The drink could be served in larger doses, and it was common for people to share their containers, something that may seem strange today. But at the time, it was a symbol of friendship and trust. Another important point is that the alcohol content of drinks varied. Beer, for example, could have a much lower alcohol content, something close to a lighter fermented drink, while mead and wine could have higher concentrations, which meant that people had to drink in moderation to avoid getting completely drunk. Even so, it was not uncommon to see customers overdoing it and causing trouble in taverns, which required great care on the part of owners and employees. In addition to direct consumption, beverages also played a very important social role. Having a beer or mead with friends was a way to strengthen bonds, negotiate business deals, and even resolve disputes. In some cultures, toasting was a ritual with deep meanings, including protection against evil spirits and a demonstration of loyalty. Therefore, drinking in a tavern was much more than just quenching thirst. It was a social act loaded with symbolism. Interestingly, the quality of drinking water in the Middle Ages was quite questionable, which made drinking beer, mead, or wine a safer alternative. The fermentation process helped to eliminate harmful bacteria, making these drinks less likely to cause illness than plain water. This explains why, in many places, even children consumed diluted beer or mead in small quantities. If you're enjoying learning about these curiosities about medieval taverns, take the opportunity to like and subscribe to the channel. I also want to know, which of these drinks would you most like to try? Comment here, and let's exchange ideas. As the sun set and the streets of medieval towns and villages began to darken, taverns took on a whole new life. As daylight faded, flames from torches and fireplaces lit up the interiors of the taverns, creating a cozy yet energetic atmosphere, full of noise and movement. The tavern was, in fact, the beating heart of the nocturnal social life of the time, a place where people of all classes and professions gathered to relax, have fun, and share stories. One of the first things that caught people's attention at night were the parties that often took place. These celebrations were not just occasions for leisure, but also important times for the community to strengthen itself, celebrate harvests, battle victories, or simply to let go of the worries of everyday life. Parties could be organized by the tavern itself to attract more customers, or promoted by specific groups, such as guilds of artisans, soldiers, or merchants, who were looking for a place to socialize. Music was an essential part of these festivities. Typical instruments included lutes, flutes, fiddles, drums, and bagpipes. Musicians, who were often regulars at the tavern, played popular songs that told of love, battles, adventures, and stories of local heroes. The simple but lively melodies drew everyone into the atmosphere, causing many to get up and dance. Dancing was an important social element, where tavern visitors interacted with each other, bringing together people who in everyday life might be strangers or from different social classes. But entertainment in medieval taverns was not limited to music and dancing. Games and betting were also part of the nightlife. It was common to find tables where people could play dice, rustic boards for strategy games, or even competitions of strength, such as tugging rope or testing who could drink the fastest. Bets ranged from small personal objects to considerable amounts of coins, which could generate great tension and often confusion. Games were also a form of socializing, bringing strangers together and creating friendly rivalries, or sometimes open enemies. The mix of alcohol, loud music, and fervent gambling created an environment ripe for conflict. Fights were not uncommon, and tavern keepers had to be prepared to maintain order, often calling on strong assistants or even local guards to intervene. However, despite the occasional incident, fights generally followed unwritten rules of respect, as everyone knew that the tavern was a community space. Although chaotic, it was a place that fostered social interaction and, paradoxically, long-term peaceful coexistence. Another interesting aspect of tavern nightlife was the performances of traveling entertainers, such as bards and storytellers. These characters traveled from village to village, entertaining the audience with epic songs, poems, and accounts of historical or legendary events. Stories were often passed down orally, and taverns served as centers of cultural dissemination and collective memory. These performances helped to preserve traditions, create local identity, and even provide moments of reflection amidst the revelry. Furthermore, taverns at night were places where news arrived and spread quickly. Without modern means of communication, the tavern functioned as a sort of information clearinghouse. Messages were exchanged, rumors were spread, news of wars, markets, royal weddings, and local misfortunes circulated among the regulars. This made the environment even more dynamic and relevant to people's daily lives. It is important to remember that although taverns were public spaces, they were not accessible to everyone all the time. There were rules and customs that regulated who could enter and how to behave. Some simpler taverns welcomed mainly workers and peasants, while others, especially in larger cities, attracted merchants, officials, and even nobles, looking for a more popular or discreet contact. The location, time, and target audience influenced the type of party and the atmosphere of the tavern at night. Another fascinating point is how taverns, despite their reputation for being places of drinking and confusion, were also environments where alliances, lasting friendships, and even business partnerships were formed. It was not uncommon to see important negotiations taking place there, while those involved enjoyed a mug of beer or a glass of mead. It was a space where, for a few hours, social barriers could become less rigid and people could get to know each other beyond labels and professions. In addition to the internal activity, the tavern also influenced the external environment, especially in small towns and cities. It was common for nearby streets to be lit with torches or lanterns to ensure safety and facilitate the arrival of customers. And, in many cases, the tavern functioned as a meeting point for groups who then went on to other nocturnal activities, such as hunting, community vigils, or even small parties in private homes. For those who visited a medieval tavern, the night was a magical time, where the rigid routine of medieval life gave way to relaxation, creativity, and socialization. At the same time as being a place of entertainment, the tavern represented the link between past and present, where traditions were lived intensely and adapted to people's daily lives. If you're enjoying this trip back in time and want to continue exploring life inside medieval taverns, don't forget to leave a comment, share your questions, and of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next blocks full of incredible stories and details. And take the opportunity to tell us here, what kind of medieval party would you most like to attend? A lively night with music and dancing, a games tournament, or perhaps a storytelling circle? Having experienced all the hustle and bustle, parties, and nightlife in medieval taverns, it's time to explore a fundamental and compelling aspect of any visit to a tavern: the food. Eating was not only a necessity for medieval inhabitants, but also an important part of the social and cultural experience of these places. Tavern cuisine brought much more to the table than simple sustenance. It reflected economic conditions, local climate, traditions, religious influences, and even social hierarchies. As soon as you entered the tavern, the smell of pots and pans, freshly baked bread, and aromatic herbs would awaken your senses and announce that food would play a central role in the experience of the space. The kitchen in the taverns was not like modern kitchens with sophisticated equipment or a huge variety of fresh and imported ingredients. Everything there was simple and straightforward, but with intense flavors that came from the cook's skill in combining what nature and the local economy had to offer. The main staple of the medieval diet was bread, and it was always present in taverns. Made from a variety of flours, bread could be made from rye, barley, or wheat, depending on the region and the season. Bread was not only served as an accompaniment to meals, but often functioned as a dish in itself, where broths, meats, or sauces were placed. In some simpler taverns, customers even used pieces of bread to mop up the remains of food on their plates, something that may seem strange today but was natural at the time. Speaking of meat, it was a highly valued ingredient, but not so accessible to everyone. Taverns that served the common population offered less noble cuts of meat, such as pork, chicken, lamb, and sometimes even game when available. Meat was usually prepared boiled or roasted, seasoned with local herbs, salt, and, when possible, imported spices that began to arrive through the trade routes. At more affluent feasts or taverns, dishes with veal or beef were more common and could be served with rich sauces, made with wine, honey, and spices. But meat was not the only food served. Vegetables, grains, and greens grown in nearby gardens or purchased at the market were an essential part of the meals. Soups and stews were common dishes, prepared with peas, onions, carrots, turnips, cabbage, and leeks, all cooked in simple broths that varied according to what was available that day. These stews, often served in large earthenware bowls, were tasty, nutritious, and easy to share among several people, which reinforced the communal nature of tavern meals. A curious and important item on the tavern menu was cheese. Fresh and cured cheeses were consumed regularly, especially in regions where goat and sheep farming was common. Cheese could be served with bread or used to enhance soups and hot dishes. Its flavor varied greatly, from mild to very strong, depending on the curing time and local technique. As for drinks, although beer and mead were the stars of the taverns, drinking water was scarce and not always reliable. Therefore, the consumption of fermented beverages was even a health issue, as it helped to avoid diseases transmitted by contaminated water. Wine, although present, was more common among the wealthier classes, but in larger taverns and in cities, it could be found in simpler versions, with a less refined flavor, served to accompany meals. Another essential detail of meals was the use of herbs and spices to add flavor. Fresh herbs such as parsley, thyme, rosemary, coriander, and basil were grown in nearby gardens and were often used to season food. More exotic spices, such as cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and ginger, were imported from distant regions and were therefore expensive and used sparingly, usually in festive dishes. However, we cannot forget the restrictions imposed by religion, which played a crucial role in medieval diets. In many places, people observed fasting days, during which they could not eat meat, only fish or vegetarian foods. Therefore, taverns also had to offer alternatives, such as fish stews, seafood dishes, or soups made only with vegetables and grains. Meals in taverns were usually simple, served on clay or wooden plates, with unusual cutlery. People mainly used their hands to eat, accompanied by small knives for cutting. Forks only became popular much later, and the way people ate reflected the spirit of the time. Food was meant to be shared, and eating was a social experience that brought people together, strengthening bonds and celebrating community life. Furthermore, the food in the tavern was a mix of flavors and textures that did not always please all modern palates. Some medieval delicacies might seem strange today, such as dishes made with animal parts that are rarely consumed today, heart, liver, tongue, or preparations with ingredients that were little known outside of that time. But these food choices were part of survival, of making the most of local resources and culture. For people who worked all day, especially farmers, artisans, and merchants who frequented taverns, meals there were a time to relax and nourish themselves. Many chose dishes that were substantial and energetic to endure the long hours. For visitors from higher classes, the cuisine could be more elaborate, even in the simplicity of a tavern, demonstrating status and good taste. Therefore, when thinking about medieval gastronomy, it is essential to remember that it was not just about flavors, but about history, culture, and society. The food served in taverns was a reflection of the medieval world in all its complexity, showing the relationships between man, nature, economy, and religion. If you're enjoying learning more about this universe, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next blocks. And tell me, which medieval dish would you like to try? Or which interesting fact about food at that time surprised you the most so far? Leave your comment. I love hearing your opinion. If in the previous section we explored the gastronomy and food that filled the tables of medieval taverns, now it's time to delve into one of the elements that really set the tone for these environments, drinks. In the medieval world, drinking something other than water was more than just a habit. It was part of everyday life, culture, and even survival. After all, water, which today is a basic and reliable item, was often contaminated back then, making fermented drinks a safer and more appreciated alternative. In taverns, the most common and popular drinks were beer, mead, and in some places, wine. Each had its own history, production process, and preferred clientele, also reflecting the geographical and social particularities of the time. Medieval beer was not exactly like the beer we know today, with its variety of styles and flavors. It was generally a more rustic drink, with a lower alcohol content, made primarily from fermented barley and flavored with herbs that replaced hops, which would only begin to be used more widely well after the Middle Ages. The brewing process involved fermenting malted barley in hot water, with the addition of herbs such as rosemary, sage, or even pine to add flavor and help preserve it. This beverage was consumed in large quantities by peasants, artisans, merchants, and urban workers. Beer was cheap, relatively easy to produce and accessible, and was often the main source of liquid calories in people's daily lives. It was also common for children to drink a less alcoholic version called small beer, which helped to hydrate and nourish them. Furthermore, beer played a very important social role. Taverns were meeting places to talk, negotiate, and relax after a hard day's work, all while drinking a mug of beer. At parties and celebrations, beer flowed in abundance, strengthening bonds and creating a cheerful, sometimes even noisy atmosphere full of singing and laughter. Mead, made from fermented honey, had an almost magical aura. Widely consumed in cold, rural regions where beekeeping was common, it was considered a noble drink and linked to ancient traditions. In medieval folklore and literature, mead was associated with warriors, kings, and gods, a true symbol of power and prestige. Producing mead required good quality honey and time for fermentation, making the drink somewhat rarer and more expensive than beer. Its sweet and delicate flavor won over those looking for something different in taverns, especially during parties or special occasions. Wine was far from being the common drink of popular taverns, but in larger cities and establishments frequented by the nobility or wealthy merchants, it had its place. Produced mainly in the Mediterranean regions, wine arrived in taverns in various qualities. There were simpler wines, with a more acidic and rustic flavor, which could be consumed by the middle classes, and fine, aged and imported wines intended for the elite. It was common for wine to be mixed with spices, honey or hot water to create the so-called hippocras, aromatic and medicinal drinks, much appreciated at banquets and parties. Furthermore, wine had a strong connection with the church and religion. Wine used in religious ceremonies helped to give the drink a sacred character, which influenced its presence in the taverns of monasteries, where monks also made their own wines and beers. In addition to these main beverages, taverns also offered other options such as cider, made from fermented apples, which was popular in regions with a climate suitable for orchards. Fermented fruit drinks, herbal teas, and even fermented milk were also on the menu in certain places, depending on the culture and available resources. It was common for each tavern to have its own recipe or special way of preparing drinks, varying the ingredients used to give the product a unique touch. This diversity made the experience even more interesting for visitors, who could try different flavors depending on the region, the type of event, and the taste of the public. Drinking in taverns was not just a matter of quenching one's thirst or getting food. It was a social act that brought together people from different backgrounds, professions, and classes. In the heat of the moment, people felt more relaxed, willing to talk, exchange stories, make friends, or even settle disputes. The tavern was a space where social barriers could be temporarily forgotten, creating a kind of ephemeral, lively, and plural community. Of course, it wasn't all about partying. Excessive drinking could also lead to trouble, fights, and problems with local authorities who often tried to control excesses by imposing rules on the sale and consumption of alcoholic beverages. But in general, alcohol was an integral part of tavern culture and medieval life. If you're enjoying learning more about what life was like in medieval taverns, leave a like and share it with your friends. Which drink do you find most interesting? Rustic medieval beer, sweet mead, or sophisticated wine? Tell me in the comments. Entering a medieval tavern wasn't just about finding tables full of food and mugs overflowing with drink. It was also about being surrounded by sounds that created a vibrant, welcoming, and festive atmosphere. Music in taverns was much more than mere entertainment. It served as an essential element in bringing people together, strengthening bonds and making the night an unforgettable moment. Let's learn what these sounds were like, who played them, and how music transformed the tavern into a true stage of medieval life. Music was an integral part of medieval culture, from the castles of nobles to the streets of towns and cities. In taverns, it had a social and functional role. It entertained customers, set the pace of parties, accompanied dances, and even facilitated conversation, helping to break the ice between strangers. In a time without electricity, live music was the best and only way to create a festive atmosphere. In addition, the songs sung in taverns often told stories of daily life, love affairs, battles, gossip, and local events. In this way, music helped spread news, preserve oral traditions, and reinforce the sense of community. Many traveling musicians, known as minstrels or jugglers, traveled through towns and cities carrying their songs and instruments to play in taverns. They were popular artists who, in addition to playing and singing, often told stories, performed plays, and even acted as intermediaries between people, creating connections. Some larger or more frequented taverns could hire permanent musicians who became part of the atmosphere and identity of the place. There were also regulars who, equipped with some musical talent, would get together to play and sing, creating spontaneous and joyful moments. The musical instruments of the time were very different from those we use today, but they were equally capable of producing lively and infectious sounds. Some of the most common were alli, a stringed instrument similar to a small violin, played with a bow. It produced high-pitched melodic sounds, perfect for songs and dances. Recorder and recorder, wind instruments that offered soft and light notes, used both to accompany singing and for solos. Rabel, a type of medieval violin, similar to the viela, very popular among itinerant musicians. Drum, used to mark the rhythm, It was essential to accompany dances and festive songs. Accordion. Although it was more popular in specific regions, it was already beginning to appear in taverns, bringing vibrant and festive sounds. Zanfona, a plucked string instrument with a crank, producing a continuous and hypnotic sound. Each instrument had its role, and musicians often combined several of them to create a harmonious and lively ensemble. The music played in the taverns varied, from simple love songs to epic ballads that narrated heroic deeds and local legends. Many of these songs were passed down orally from generation to generation, taking on different versions depending on the place and the musicians. Dances accompanied by music could be performed in circles, in pairs or groups, and were very popular. People took the opportunity to have fun, release energy, and socialize. Some of these dances were simple movements, but others required more coordination and rhythm. In addition to traditional songs, taverns also hosted improvised music, made on the spot to liven up the atmosphere or react to special events, such as the arrival of an important guest, news from the city, or a friendly dispute. Music in taverns also helped to balance the social atmosphere. In an environment that brought together different social classes, professions, and personalities, music created a common space where everyone could join in the party. Group singing, clapping, and dancing helped to dissolve tension and facilitate social interaction. It was common for customers to challenge the musicians with requests for specific songs or even to sing along, making the event more collective. In many moments, the music became the protagonist of the night, making visitors forget their worries and surrender to the pleasure of socializing. Taverns, with their music and entertainment, served as cultural centers where traditions were alive and vibrant. Without today's technology, these spaces were essential for the circulation of stories, songs, and news. They also provided an opportunity for popular musicians to showcase their talent, keep the art alive, and help strengthen ties between people. In some taverns, minstrels had their own forbidden repertoire, with funny or critical songs that were only sung in low voices to avoid problems with authorities or religious figures. Music was also used to signal the beginning and end of services in taverns, marking the moments when customers should leave or enjoy the last round. During festivals or special dates, taverns organized musical competitions with symbolic prizes for the best singers or instrumentalists. Did you enjoy discovering how music made taverns such special places? If you like this medieval vibe, leave a comment telling us which instrument you would like to learn to play. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes of this trip back in time. In the next section, we will delve into the world of medieval games and entertainment that livened up nights in taverns. Get ready to learn about dice, board games, and other forms of entertainment that you may never have imagined existed back then. If today we go to a bar to chat, listen to music, or play pool, in the Middle Ages, the tavern was the ideal place to try out a variety of pastimes, some curious, others competitive, and even dangerous, depending on the mood of those involved. Games were part of the nightly routine in taverns, and more than just entertainment, they served to show off skill, earn coins, settle disagreements, or simply pass the time while the mug emptied. Let's explore these games, the most popular types, how they worked, and what they reveal about the medieval mentality. People have always enjoyed having fun. Even in hard times with exhausting work and few guarantees of survival, human beings sought moments of leisure. In taverns, this manifested itself in laughter, music, and games. It was there that travelers tested their luck, peasants distracted themselves after their journey in the fields, and even merchants made bets while waiting for the next transaction. The games were accessible, fast-paced, and engaging. All it took was a few pebbles, a handful of dice, or a rustic board to turn the table into a friendly battlefield. And as alcohol flowed freely, tempers flared as well. The game didn't always end peacefully, which made the atmosphere even more unpredictable and, for many, exciting. Without a doubt, dice were the kings of the tavern. They were small, portable, cheap, and could be used in 1,000 ways. Made of bone, wood, or metal, These cubes were often not exactly symmetrical, which added an extra element of suspicion and controversy to the games. Dice games varied greatly. Some involved pure luck, others required bluffing or even rudimentary mathematics. The most common was hazard, the ancestor of our modern craps, where players bet on numbers before rolling the dice. But there were simpler variations, such as sevens game or high or low, where players tried to predict the outcome of the rolls. Gambling was almost always part of the game. Not just money, you could gamble for food, drink, personal items, and even embarrassing promises like singing out loud, dancing on a table, or cleaning someone's boots. The important thing was the challenge, and of course, the fun. It wasn't just dice that dominated the fun. Many gamers also enjoyed board games which required more attention and reasoning. One of the most popular was the mill game, also called Nine Men's Morris, a sort of ancestor of the old well-known checkers, played on a board with 9 main points. The goal was to form lines and remove the opponent's pieces, simple to learn but difficult to master. Another popular game was Alquerque, the predecessor of checkers, with rules that varied from region to region. More sophisticated players tried their hand at chess, brought from the Iberian Peninsula, with its symbolic pieces and more in-depth strategies. Although it was not as common in taverns in small villages, it was popular among nobles and could be played in wealthier inns, frequented by wealthy travelers. Boards could be carved directly on wooden tables or drawn with charcoal and chalk. The pieces, in turn, were improvised with whatever was at hand: pebbles, bottle caps, pieces of bone, or even pieces of dry bread. The tavern's regulars didn't live by their minds alone. Many games required strength, balance, or manual skills. A curious example was the stick game, where 2 participants held a short stick and tried to pull their opponent without letting go. The winner was whoever made the other one let go or fall. Another popular game was Lucky Finger, where 2 players crossed their index fingers and tried to force their opponent's index fingers down. It seemed simple, but it required strength and endurance. Some versions involved other fingers, or even the use of the palm of the hand as leverage. Some taverns also organized small impromptu competitions of arm wrestling, throwing objects, or balancing tests with full mugs. These physical games often attracted large audiences and turned into real spontaneous shows. Gambling was part of the gambling culture. There was a certain acceptance that losing was part of the experience, although not everyone took it kindly. Since the rules were not always clear and often changed at the whim of the participants, arguments were common. In some cases, the tavern keeper had to intervene before a fight turned into a brawl. On the other hand, betting was also a form of socialization. Even those who lost gained popularity. If they knew how to laugh at themselves, or if they offered a round to their colleagues as a way of making up for it, this spirit of camaraderie was essential to keeping the environment lively and safe. Some regulars gained fame for their skill at specific games. Some were known as unbeatable at dice, strategists on the boards, or masters of betting. These players became recognized figures, sometimes even feared, and brought prestige to the tavern they frequented. On the other hand, cheaters also existed. Rigged dice, too fast moves, or misleading bets could deeply irritate opponents. Discovering a cheater was grounds for public humiliation, and in extreme cases, expulsion or physical punishment. Tavern games were more than just pastimes. They were part of the social fabric of medieval life. They were an outlet for the tensions of everyday life, a means of interaction, and a theater of emotions. Even with unstable rules and unpredictable results, they fulfilled their purpose, bringing people together, provoking laughter, challenging fate, and of course filling the nights with great excitement. The medieval tavern was not just a place to stop for food and drink. It was, above all, a social venue, a kind of microcosm of society at the time. These places were home to all kinds of people, from the weary peasant to the mysterious traveler, from the itinerant artist to the witty beggar. And each character who passed through there left their mark, whether with stories, tricks, mischief, or simply with their unusual presence. In this section, we will take a look at the most eccentric types that could be found in this lively and unpredictable setting. He was the classic unknown. He would arrive at the tavern with his cloak dirty with dust, the hood covering part of his face, and an ever-alert look in his eyes. No one knew for sure where he came from, what he was doing, or what he carried in his small leather backpack, but his presence aroused curiosity and silent respect. He would usually sit in a corner, watch everything, order a strong drink and say little, but all it took was a misinterpreted comment or a bad bet for him to suddenly reveal a sword or a dagger and show that he was no ordinary person. Some said they were ex-soldiers, others believed they were messengers of kings or even spies. The truth? No one knew, and perhaps it was better that way. In contrast to the mysterious wanderer, the artist was loud, full of mannerisms, and always eager to attract attention. He might be a musician with a worn-out flute, a storyteller with a voice trained for drama, or even a juggler improvising with fruit and wooden spoons. These artists were welcomed, especially by the tavern owners. After all, they attracted an audience, raised the general mood and encouraged consumption. They often performed in exchange for food, drink, or a makeshift bed in the back. And it was not uncommon for them to become romantically involved with some enchanted listener, which of course could cause confusion. They were the bearers of news, bringing news from other lands, rumors of wars and gossip from castles. Sometimes their stories were exaggerated, but always well told. For a people accustomed to the harshness of routine, these moments of magic and laughter were a balm. Every tavern had its regular drunkard, the one who started the day smelling of alcohol, who knew everyone's name and who everyone knew. He was a regular figure, often tolerated more out of habit than sympathy. He spoke loudly, laughed to himself, told the same stories 1,000 times, and was also, in many cases, a well of popular wisdom. This character, despite his constant state of drunkenness, served as a bridge between the groups. He was the one who told what had happened the night before, who knew about the fights, the reconciliations, the mysterious disappearances, and when he didn't know, he made things up. After all, part of the charm of the tavern was precisely this: mix of truth and imagination. Ah, the charlatan! With colourful clothes, a small wooden chest and a sharp tongue, he arrived promising cures for all ills. He left bottles on the table, filled with colourful liquids and potions with extravagant names: elixir of eternal youth, healing dragon water, essence of ancient wisdom. His gift of the gab was captivating. He would say that he had saved nobles from death, that he was an apprentice to a famous alchemist, or that he had learned his secrets from an Eastern monk. And no matter how suspicious many were, there were always those who bought it, sometimes more for the spectacle than for the hope of a cure. From time to time, some dissatisfied customer would try to demand the promised miracle. But the charlatan, skilled at getting out of trouble, would already be far away when this happened, or if he wasn't, he knew how to get away with a magic trick or an excuse so absurd that it became the joke of the night. Although often marginalized, women also frequented taverns, especially in regions with less strict gender separation. One of the most curious figures was the herbal lady, part healer, part counselor, part folkloric figure. She always carried a basket with leaves, roots, and tea bottles. She sold natural remedies, made calming teas, helped treat wounds, and in exchange received coins or meals. She was also sought out for love advice, predictions of the future, or recipes to improve virility, which always brought laughter. Some were respected, others feared. Many were called witches by those who did not understand their knowledge, but they all had one thing in common: they knew how to listen. And that, in an age with so few emotional outlets, was precious. Rich, talkative, and always carrying exotic things, the merchant was a rare but unforgettable figure. He would appear from time to time, dressed in shiny fabrics, with rings on his fingers and smelling of spices. He would sit in the center of the tavern, order the best dishes and pay with coins that no one saw every day. He told stories of his travels to distant lands, showing unusual objects, compasses, maps, perfumes, colorful fabrics, unknown instruments. He spoke of pirates, deserts, giant animals, and storms at sea. He was a natural storyteller, and his presence made the night in the tavern seem magical. Where there are crowds, there are those who want to take advantage. In taverns, it was no different. Small-time swindlers, sometimes children or teenagers, would roam among the tables looking for distractions. They would steal purses, exchange coins for counterfeit ones, or pretend to be the tavern keeper's assistants to collect tips. Some tavern owners tolerated them, especially if they helped out occasionally. Others firmly chased them away. But it was hard to keep them at bay, especially on busy nights. Amid the laughter, music, and raised mugs, petty thefts went unnoticed or were ignored as part of local folklore. These figures, eccentric, unique, human, transformed the medieval tavern into a true popular theatre. They were part of the charm, unpredictability, and vibrant life of these places. With them, the night was never the same as the last. There was always a new story to tell, a new confusion to discuss, a new memory to keep. When the sun set and the interior of the tavern began to be illuminated only by the flickering light of the torches and candles scattered in the corners, something changed in the air. If during the day the environment was noisy but functional, at night it transformed into a territory of impulses. Conversations became looser, laughter louder, glances longer, and problems more likely. In this section, we delve into the darker and also more exciting side of medieval taverns. What happened when dawn took over? There was no control over consumption or limit on servings like in modern bars. Customers drank as much as their pockets or bodies could handle, and many, of course, didn't know when to stop. It was common to see men, and sometimes women, who started the night in moderation and ended up staggering, laughing alone, or crying over old memories. Excessive alcohol consumption changed personalities. The calm person became aggressive. The introspective person became talkative. The shy person became bold. Just one extra glass was enough for friendships to turn into arguments and jokes to turn into insults. It was during this transition that fights broke out. At the slightest sign of disagreement, a dirty look, a sly word, a taunt about someone's wife, the atmosphere would change. Benches would be pushed aside, glasses would be broken, and suddenly two men would be standing, glaring at each other. Sometimes a quick intervention would be enough to calm things down. Other times the conflict would turn physical. The fights started with shoving, then came punches. Some escalated to the use of objects, mugs, stools, or even knives hidden under belts. Depending on the region or clientele, the violence could be intense. In some taverns, the owners had security guards, strong men armed with clubs, who intervened quickly. In others, the crowd simply watched or moved away, already accustomed to this nightly spectacle. But there were also consequences. Wounded people being carried out, blood on the floor, and in more serious cases, the involvement of the city guard, when there was one. The reputation of the tavern was shaped by these occurrences. Some were known as peaceful, where families could gather. Others had a reputation for being dangerous, attracting precisely those looking for trouble. But the early hours of the morning weren't all about fights. The other side of the coin was the birth of romances, or at least impulsive encounters. The atmosphere of the tavern, with music, drinks, and conversation, was fertile ground for flirting. Exchanging glances, shy laughter, exaggerated compliments, and, in many cases, stolen kisses behind the wooden columns or whispered promises at the bar. Of course, many of these relationships were fleeting. The next day, few remembered what was said or promised, but that didn't stop the constant search for connection. For those who spent their days working hard, the tavern offered a chance, however brief, to feel desired, seen, alive. In some regions, prostitutes frequented taverns and took part in this game. Some worked independently, others were protected by armed men. The subject was surrounded by taboos, but it was still an everyday reality in these places. While the main hall was buzzing with music, laughter, and fights, there were also dark corners, and in them, different conversations took place. Illicit business, exchange of information, smuggling agreements. Inconspicuous-looking men sat together, exchanging quick words and leaving coins under the table. Sometimes, not even that. Taverns near trade routes or ports were especially targeted by these types of encounters. Merchants, made deals with pirates, corrupt guards took bribes, and criminals planned scams. It was difficult for the tavern owner to control everything, and many preferred to look the other way. After all, as long as they paid and didn't cause a scene, they were just more customers. Many travelers used the tavern not only as a place to eat and drink, but also as a place to stay. The problem was that as night fell, the atmosphere became unpredictable. If you slept in a corner, you might wake up without your bag. If you drank too much and passed out on the floor, you might be accidentally kicked in the middle of a fight. Some taverns had rooms on the upper floors, accessible only to those who paid well. Others improvised spaces in the barn or even on the kitchen floor. There was also the risk of sleeping next to strangers who did not have the best intentions. Therefore, the most experienced travelers knew how to choose where to sleep. They observed the movement, talked to the innkeeper, and, whenever possible, slept with a dagger under their pillow. When the sky began to lighten and the first roosters crowed, there were few left inside the tavern. The floor was dirty, with pieces of bread, wine stains, and sometimes even teeth lost in fights. The tavern keeper and his assistants cleaned in silence, tired, but already thinking about the next night. Some customers were still asleep, leaning against the tables. Others were stumbling out. The music had stopped. The laughter had died down, and the air was filled with the smell of the night that had passed, a mixture of smoke, sweat, alcohol, and unfinished stories. Because that was what the tavern delivered, nights that left their mark. For better or worse, no one left indifferent. And the next day everyone would tell what they saw, exaggerating here and there, turning simple events into local legends. After so many details, smells, sounds, stories, encounters, and missed encounters, we have reached the end of this journey. Through time and space to the beating heart of medieval life, the tavern. But what was it like to visit a medieval tavern? Much more than just rustic wooden walls and worn benches, the tavern was a mirror of the society of its time. It was there that the disguised nobleman and the talkative peasant, the wandering musician and the shrewd merchant, the homesick drunkard and the traveler full of stories met. It was a point of intersection where lives crossed, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict, but always with intensity. In this final block, we will recap everything we saw with that perspective that only gains strength at the end of a journey. And of course, we will do this as if it were our last mug of the night, one that we savor slowly, enjoying each sip before continuing on our way. Over the course of the previous 25 blocks, we saw that the medieval tavern was, yes, a place where people ate well, by the standards of the time, and where drinks flowed freely. But it was above all a stage, a space for socializing where stories were born, exchanged, or simply lost in the smoke of the candles. The food was simple, but full of meaning. The drink was the guiding thread of emotions, and the sounds of laughter, clinking mugs, out-of-tune instruments, intense conversations, made the tavern a living organism, breathing along with the people. We visited the tavern as if we were medieval characters. We understood how it worked, who frequented it, what was eaten, what was drunk, what was heard, and even what was feared there. We discovered that the tavern keeper was more than a merchant. He was an arbitrator, an advisor, a host, and sometimes a peacemaker. We learned that every detail, from the wooden bench to the music played by a lutenist, had a function. Everything contributed to a social microcosm, where the norms of the city, the village, or the fiefdom were momentarily suspended or reinvented. We also saw the dark side, fights, betrayals, lies, and dangers that were hidden between one joke and another. After all, the tavern was also a place of excesses, of loose impulses, of encounters that changed destinies, not always for the better. You may be wondering, why dive so deep into such an ancient place, so far removed from our modern reality? And the answer is perhaps simpler than it seems, because there, among barrels and torches, we find pieces of ourselves. The medieval tavern reminds us of something that hasn't changed, the human desire to come together, to laugh together, to tell stories, to forget the burdens of life for a while, to find solace in a stranger, to be part of something, even if just for a night. These spaces still exist, even if under a different name. They are found in corner bars, at family parties, and in conversations with friends. The tavern, after all, is a symbol, and knowing its history also means knowing a little more about what makes us human. If you've made it this far, it says a lot about you. It says you're curious, passionate about knowledge, and willing to dive deep into stories that few allow themselves to explore. And that's rare and valuable. So, before blowing out the candles in this virtual tavern, I want to make you a very special invitation. If this video has sparked your imagination, if you felt like you were inside a tavern with a mug in your hand and eyes attentive to every conversation, if you enjoy well-told stories, historical curiosities, and time travel narrated with humor and intelligence. So don't let this journey end here. Subscribe to the channel and join our digital tavern. Yes, we live in modern times, but the spirit of the tavern lives on, here, on this channel. Each new video is like a new night, a new round, a new story being told around the table. By signing up, you join our small brotherhood of time travelers, people who like to learn while having fun, people who value content made with dedication, research, and soul. And if you enjoyed this journey, you already know, activate the bell so you don't miss the next episodes, leave your like. It helps a lot. And comment below. Which part of this visit to the tavern surprised you the most? Or better yet, if you could visit a medieval tavern for a day, what would you do first? And like any good storyteller, we never say the end. We say, until the next bonfire, until the next mug, until the next dive in time. Because a good story never really ends. It just rests for a while until it's called back. Thank you for walking with me this far, and remember, history is alive, you just have to know where to look. See you in the next video.